The old community center on Maple Street had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls and the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting uneven shadows across the worn linoleum floors. But every Tuesday evening, it came alive with the chatter of adults eager to learn something new. Margaret walked through the heavy glass doors, her footsteps barely making a sound on the floor. She wore a simple navy cardigan that had been washed so many times it had lost its original shape, paired with dark pants and comfortable shoes that had walked countless miles. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried everything she needed in a faded canvas bag that had traveled with her across an ocean. At 45, Margaret had learned to make herself small in crowded spaces. She had perfected the art of blending into backgrounds, of being present without drawing attention. Tonight was no different. She slipped into the classroom and found a seat in the back corner, away from the clusters of people already deep in conversation. The room buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. There was Betty, a retired nurse who had always wanted to understand classical music better. She sat in the front row, her notebook already open and ready. Nearby, Tom adjusted his reading glasses while flipping through a music magazine he had brought along. He owned a small hardware store and figured learning about music might help him connect better with his teenage daughter who played violin. Then there was Janet, a bank manager who spoke loudly about her recent vacation to Europe and how she had been absolutely moved by a concert she attended in Vienna. She gestured dramatically as she described the experience, making sure everyone within earshot could hear about her cultural awakening. Margaret listened to these conversations while organizing her own simple supplies. She had brought a small notebook, already half filled with neat handwriting and a single pen. No fancy folders or highlighters like some of the other students, just the basics, which was how she approached most things in life these days. Dr. Richard Williams entered the room with the confidence of someone who had been teaching for over 20 years. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. His tweed jacket and polished shoes spoke of academic success and comfortable living. He had taught music theory at the local college before retiring, to teach community classes, something he claimed to do for the joy of sharing knowledge with eager minds. As he arranged his materials at the front of the room, his eyes swept across his new students. He made mental notes about each person, sizing them up the way teachers often do. When his gaze landed on Margaret, sitting quietly in her corner, he paused for just a moment. Something about her stillness, her careful attention to her surroundings, made him wonder about her story. "Good evening, everyone," Dr. Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Welcome to Music, Appreciation for Adults. I'm delighted to see such a diverse group here tonight." The introductions began predictably enough. Betty shared her nursing background and her love for classical radio. Tom mentioned his daughter and his hope to understand her musical world better. Janet launched into another story about her European concert experience, somehow managing to mention the expensive hotel she had stayed at twice. When it was Margaret's turn, the room grew quiet. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that her accent would immediately mark her as different as other. She cleared her throat softly. "My name is Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words carried the gentle traces of her homeland, vowels shaped by a different tongue, consonants softened by years of practice in a second language. "I work cleaning houses. I like music very much." The simplicity of her introduction hung in the air. While others had elaborated on their backgrounds, their motivations, their experiences, Margaret had offered only the basics. Some students exchanged glances, the kind of looks that people give when they think they understand someone's entire story from just a few words. Dr. Williams smiled at her, but it was the kind of smile adults give to children when they're trying too hard to be encouraging. "That's wonderful, Margaret. Music is truly universal, isn't it? It doesn't matter what language we speak or what work we do. Music speaks to everyone." He meant well, but his tone was slightly louder when he addressed her, slightly slower, as if volume and pace could bridge whatever gap he imagined existed between them. Margaret nodded politely, used to such interactions. As the class progressed, Dr. Williams launched into his introduction to music appreciation. He talked about rhythm and melody, about how music had evolved through the centuries. He played examples on a small sound system, pausing to ask questions and encourage discussion. Margaret listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in her careful handwriting. But mostly, she absorbed everything with the kind of focused attention that came from genuine passion. When Dr. Williams played a piece by Bach, she closed her eyes briefly, and for just a moment her fingers moved almost imperceptibly, as if she were playing along on an invisible keyboard. During the break, the other students clustered together, sharing coffee from paper cups and getting to know each other better. Margaret remained at her seat, quietly reviewing her notes. She overheard fragments of conversations about favorite musicians, concert experiences, and music lessons from childhood. "I took piano lessons for 3 years when I was young," Betty was saying. "Wish I had stuck with it. My mother always said I had potential." "Music is so expensive to learn properly," Tom added. "The good teachers charge a fortune. We're lucky to have Dr. Williams here at such a reasonable price." Janet nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Quality education shouldn't be limited to those who can afford private conservatory training." Margaret sipped water from a small bottle she had brought from home and continued listening. These people spoke about music education as something precious and rare, something that required significant financial investment to achieve. They weren't wrong, but their assumption that expensive necessarily meant better showed how little they understood about passion and dedication. When class resumed, Dr. Williams continued his overview of musical periods. He discussed the Baroque era, then moved through classical and into Romantic periods. Margaret found herself silently filling in details he left out, remembering lessons from long ago, concerts she had attended, pieces she had studied in depth. As the evening wound down, Dr. Williams gave them their assignment for the following week. "I want you all to listen to 3 different pieces from 3 different time periods. Notice what makes them distinct. Think about how the music makes you feel, what images it brings to your mind. Don't worry about technical terms yet. Just listen and experience." Students began packing up their belongings, chatting about their plans for the week. Margaret quietly slipped her notebook into her canvas bag and prepared to leave. She had a long bus ride ahead of her, and tomorrow would start early with her first cleaning appointment at 6 in the morning. "Margaret," Dr. Williams called out, as she reached the door. She turned back, wondering if she had forgotten something. "I'm glad you decided to join us. Sometimes the students who speak the least have the most to offer." She nodded politely and smiled. "Thank you. See you next." As she walked to the bus stop under the flickering streetlights, Margaret reflected on the evening. The other students seemed nice enough, if a bit presumptuous in their assumptions about her. Dr. Williams appeared knowledgeable, though his approach felt somewhat textbook-oriented. But she had enjoyed being in a room full of people who loved music, even if they didn't know her own relationship with it. For 2 hours she had been surrounded by melodies and harmonies, by discussions of composers and performances. It had felt like coming home to a world she had been forced to leave behind. The bus arrived, mostly empty at this late hour. Margaret found a seat by the window and watched the city pass by in streaks of light. Tomorrow she would return to her quiet world of cleaning supplies and other people's homes. But tonight, she had sat in a room where Chopin and Mozart were spoken of, like old friends, and next week she would return. The 3rd week arrived with an unexpected chill in the air. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter as she walked through the community center doors, her canvas bag tucked under her arm as usual. She had grown to look forward to these Tuesday evenings, more than she cared to admit. For 2 hours she could exist in a world where music mattered, where conversations revolved around beauty, rather than bathroom tiles and kitchen floors. Dr. Williams had set up something different tonight. Instead of just his usual chair and podium, there was a small electronic keyboard on a folding table near the front of the room. The black and white keys gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and Margaret felt her heart skip slightly at the sight of them. She took her usual seat in the back corner, watching as other students filed in. Betty waved cheerfully from her front row spot, already chatting with Tom about a classical radio program she had discovered. Janet arrived a few minutes late, apologizing loudly about traffic while making sure everyone noticed her new designer handbag. "Tonight, we're going to get hands-on," Dr. Williams announced once everyone had settled. I thought it would be helpful for you to see and hear music theory in action, not just talk about it in abstract terms. He moved to the keyboard and began demonstrating basic concepts. His fingers pressed keys deliberately as he explained major and minor scales, the difference between harmony and melody, how chords were built. The electronic sound wasn't beautiful, nothing like a real piano, but it served its purpose for education. Music theory might seem complicated, he continued, playing a simple chord progression, but it's really just a language. Once you understand the basics, you can start to decode what composers were trying to say. Margaret found herself leaning forward, slightly, drawn by the familiar sight of fingers on keys even if the sound was artificial. She had spent countless hours at keyboards and pianos over the years, but it had been months since she had seen anyone else play, even something this simple. Dr. Williams played a few more examples, then paused and looked around the room. Now, I know this might seem intimidating, but I'm wondering if any of you have ever tried playing piano before, even just a little bit. Don't be shy. A few students shifted in their seats. Tom raised his hand partway. I had a couple lessons when I was maybe 10 years old, didn't stick with it though. That counts, Dr. Williams smiled. Anyone else? The room was quiet for a moment. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She could feel Dr. Williams' eyes scanning the group, looking for volunteers. She kept her gaze down, hoping to avoid attention, but something inside her stirred at being so close to a keyboard again. Come now, Dr. Williams encouraged. This is a safe space. No judgment here. Even if you just picked out happy birthday, once that's experience. Betty shook her head with a laugh. I can barely whistle in tune. Janet launched into a story about how she had always wanted to learn piano, but her parents couldn't afford lessons. The conversation drifted for a few minutes until Dr. Williams gently steered it back. What about you, Margaret? He said suddenly, his voice carrying that same slightly louder tone he used whenever he addressed her. Have you ever tried playing piano? All eyes turned to her. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't expected to be singled out, though she realized now that her intense attention to the keyboard demonstration might have given her away. A little, she said quietly, the words barely audible. Several students exchanged smiles. There was something endearing about her modesty, they thought. Janet leaned forward in her seat, suddenly interested in encouraging what she assumed was a fellow beginner. Oh, that's wonderful, she said in an overly bright voice. We all have to start somewhere, right? Dr. Williams nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Margaret, would you like to come up and show us what you know? Even if it's just a simple melody, it would be great for everyone to see. Margaret shook her head politely. No, thank you, I am fine listening. But Dr. Williams had the bit between his teeth now. He had dealt with shy adult students before, people who were embarrassed about their limited skills. In his experience, a little gentle pushing was usually all they needed to overcome their hesitation. Come on, he said with what he thought was an encouraging smile. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. We're all learning here. What could you play for us? Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? Everyone knows that one. A few students chuckled, good-naturedly. The suggestion seemed perfectly reasonable to them. Margaret was obviously a beginner, probably someone who had picked out a few notes here and there but never had proper instruction. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star would be perfect for her skill level. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. Really, I prefer to just listen tonight. Nonsense, Dr. Williams said, his tone becoming more insistent. The best way to understand music is to make it yourself. Even something simple will help you connect with what we've been discussing. Tom nodded from his seat. He's right, you know. I always understood things better in school when I actually tried them instead of just reading about them. Betty turned in her seat to smile at Margaret. Don't worry, dear. We're not expecting a concert, just whatever you're comfortable with. Margaret looked around the room at all the expectant faces. These people meant well, she knew that. They thought they were being supportive, encouraging a nervous beginner to take a small step forward. They had no way of knowing that their simple request was asking her to reveal a part of herself she had been carefully hiding. Maybe something a little more interesting than Twinkle, Twinkle. Dr. Williams mused, warming to his role as encouraging teacher. What about Mary Had a Little Lamb? Or if you're feeling adventurous, maybe Amazing Grace. That one has a lovely melody, not too challenging. The suggestions hung in the air. Margaret realized that the longer she resisted, the more attention she was drawing to herself. The very thing she had been trying to avoid was happening anyway. Every eye in the room was focused on her, waiting to see what the quiet cleaning lady would do. I really think it would be good for your confidence, Dr. Williams pressed on, completely missing the discomfort written across Margaret's face. Sometimes, we hold ourselves back unnecessarily. A little encouragement is all we need to surprise ourselves. Janet clapped her hands together softly. Yes, exactly. I bet you're better than you think you are, Margaret. We all are our own worst critics. The conversation had taken on a momentum of its own now. What had started as a simple question had become a group effort to convince Margaret to play. The other students had bought into Dr. Williams' narrative completely. Here was a shy woman who needed their support to overcome her fears and take a small musical step forward. Margaret looked at the keyboard, its black and white keys reflecting the overhead lights. Such a simple instrument, really. Just 88 keys that could create infinite possibilities. She thought about all the hours she had spent at keyboards like this one, though most had been much finer instruments. She thought about the music that lived in her fingers, the pieces she could play from memory even after all these years. Perhaps, she said slowly, something else would be better choice. Dr. Williams brightened immediately. Of course. What did you have in mind? Something you've been practicing? The question was innocent enough, but it revealed just how little he understood about her situation. Margaret realized there was no good way to explain that she didn't practice simple melodies, that her relationship with music was far more complex than anyone in this room could imagine. I think maybe we should continue with lesson, she said diplomatically, hoping to redirect attention away from herself. But Dr. Williams was in full teaching mode now, convinced that he was witnessing a breakthrough moment. Oh no, we have plenty of time for both. Learning is supposed to be interactive, not just lecture-based. This is perfect. He gestured toward the keyboard with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was doing Margaret a great favor. Come on up whenever you're ready. Take your time. We'll all be very supportive. Margaret sat in her chair, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. She could continue to refuse, but that would only make things more awkward, draw even more attention to her resistance. Or she could walk to that keyboard and play something simple, something that would satisfy their assumptions about her abilities. But, as she looked at those keys, she knew that touching them again, even briefly, would awaken something in her that she had been working very hard to keep quiet. Music wasn't just a hobby for her, wasn't just a pleasant way to spend time. It was part of who she was, woven into her identity so deeply that she couldn't separate herself from it completely. The room waited in encouraging silence, everyone ready to applaud whatever simple melody the modest cleaning lady might manage to produce. The week passed slowly for Margaret. Every morning as she cleaned bathrooms and scrubbed floors, she found herself thinking about that keyboard sitting in the community center. The image of those black and white keys kept appearing in her mind, at the strangest moments, while she was organizing someone's kitchen cabinets, while she was waiting for the bus, while she lay in her small apartment trying to fall asleep. She had managed to escape that Tuesday evening without playing anything, but barely. Dr. Williams had seemed disappointed, and the other students had given her those sympathetic looks that people say for someone they think lacks confidence. She knew they meant well, but their pity stung more than any criticism ever. Could Tuesday came again too quickly. Margaret almost considered skipping class entirely. She stood at her apartment window watching the bus that would take her to the community center pull away from the stop across the street. She could simply stay home, maybe send Dr. Williams an email later saying she was feeling unwell. But something pulled her toward that music room. Despite everything, she genuinely enjoyed learning alongside the other students, hearing their perspectives on pieces she had known for decades. There was something refreshing about Betty's enthusiasm for discovering classical radio, or Tom's honest questions about what made one composer different from another. So she caught the next bus and arrived at the center just as class was beginning. Dr. Williams looked up from his notes as she entered. "Margaret, I'm so glad you made it. I was worried you might not come back after last week." His comment drew attention from the other students, who turned to look at her with curious expressions. Janet smiled brightly and patted the empty chair beside her. "Come sit with us tonight, dear. Don't hide in the back corner." Margaret preferred her usual spot, but refusing would only create more fuss. She sat where Janet indicated, feeling exposed away from the safety of the back row. "Before we begin tonight's lesson," Dr. Williams announced, "I want to address something from last week. I may have put some pressure on you, Margaret, and I apologize if that made you uncomfortable. But I've been thinking about it all week, and I believe I have a solution." Margaret's stomach dropped. She had hoped last week's awkwardness would be forgotten, not turned into this week's main event. "I think what happened was that I suggested pieces that were too simple," Dr. Williams continued, clearly pleased with his analysis. "You probably know songs that are more interesting than Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You need something with a bit more substance to really showcase what you can do." The other students nodded along, buying into his reasoning completely. Of course, Margaret would want to play something more challenging. They had underestimated her abilities. "So I've selected a piece that I think will be perfect," Dr. Williams said, moving toward a folder on his desk. "It's well known enough that you might have heard it before, but it has enough complexity to be interesting." He pulled out a sheet of music and held it up for the class to see. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar notes scattered across the page. "Chopin's Minute Waltz," Dr. Williams announced proudly. "Now, don't let the name fool you. It's not actually meant to be played in 1 minute, that's just a nickname. The proper name is Waltz in D-flat major, and it's quite beautiful." Margaret stared at the sheet music, her mind racing. The Minute Waltz was indeed beautiful, but it was also one of Chopin's most technically demanding pieces. The rapid runs, the delicate phrasing, the precise timing required. This wasn't a piece for beginners. This was a piece that separated serious pianists from casual players. "I thought this would be perfect for next week," Dr. Williams continued, oblivious to the magnitude of what he was asking. "It's got lovely melodies, but it's not too difficult. Perfect for someone who's been modest about their abilities." Tom leaned forward in his chair. "That's really thoughtful of you, Dr. Williams. Margaret, you must be excited to try something more substantial." Betty clapped her hands together softly. "Oh, this will be wonderful. I can't wait to hear you play it." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Perhaps something else would be better." "That piece, it is quite challenging?" Dr. Williams interrupted with a knowing smile. "I thought you might say that. But I have confidence in you, Margaret. I think you've been selling yourself short. Sometimes we need someone else to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves." Janet nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. I do the same thing. I always think I can't do something until someone pushes me to try. Besides," Dr. Williams added, "you don't have to play it perfectly. This is about learning and growing, not about performance. Just do your best with it." Margaret looked around the room at all the encouraging faces. These people had no idea what they were asking of her. To them, the Minute Waltz was simply a step up from Mary Had a Little Lamb, a slightly more interesting piece that would challenge their modest classmate without overwhelming her. "I really think a different piece would be more appropriate," she tried again, but Dr. Williams was already moving on. "Nonsense," he said firmly. "I've been teaching music for over 20 years. I know how to match students with appropriate repertoire. Trust me on this one." He handed her the sheet music, and Margaret had no choice but to take it. The paper felt familiar in her hands, though this particular edition was different from the one she had learned from many years ago. She could see small fingering notations penciled in by some previous student, recommendations that made her want to wince. "Now, I know you might not be able to read music fluently yet," Dr. Williams said in that careful, loud voice he reserved for her. "So I brought a recording as well. You can listen to it at home and get familiar with how it should sound." He held up a CD, pointing to track 7. This is performed by a very good pianist. Not too fast, nice and clear. Perfect for learning. Margaret nodded mutely, accepting the CD along with the sheet music. She glanced down at the notes on the page, and despite herself, her fingers twitched slightly as if trying to play the opening measures. "I'm really excited about this," Betty said warmly. "It's so nice to see someone challenge themselves. You're going to do beautifully, Margaret. And don't worry if you make mistakes," Tom added helpfully. "We're all here to learn, not to judge." Dr. Williams beamed at his students' supportive attitudes. "This is exactly the kind of environment we want to create. Encouraging, positive, growth-oriented." As the class continued with the evening's regular lesson, Margaret sat quietly with the sheet music in her lap. Dr. Williams discussed musical periods and compositional techniques, but her attention kept drifting to the piece she was expected to perform next week. She knew this waltz intimately. She had played it hundreds of times in practice rooms and concert halls, in competitions and recitals. She knew every phrase, every dynamic marking, every place where most pianists rushed the tempo or missed the subtle emotional shifts that made the piece more than just a display of technical skill. But that was a different life, a different Margaret. The woman sitting in this community center classroom was supposed to be someone who cleaned houses and spoke hesitantly about liking music. She wasn't supposed to be someone who could navigate Chopin's complex harmonies or execute the lightning-fast passages that made this piece famous. During the break, several students came over to chat with her about the upcoming performance. Their enthusiasm was genuine, their encouragement heartfelt, but every kind word felt like another weight added to her shoulders. "I think it's so brave of you to try something challenging," Janet said, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "I would be terrified." "The important thing is to just enjoy it," Betty added. "Don't put too much pressure on yourself. We're all rooting for you." Margaret smiled and nodded, accepting their advice while knowing that enjoyment wasn't really the issue. The problem was that playing this piece well would require her to reveal abilities that didn't fit with who she was supposed to be in this room. As class ended, Dr. Williams approached her with additional encouragement. "Remember, take your time with it this week. Don't try to play at full speed right away. Work on small sections until you're comfortable." His advice was well-meaning but completely unnecessary. Margaret could play this piece at full tempo in her sleep. The challenge wasn't learning the notes. It was figuring out how to play it badly enough to maintain her cover without insulting the music itself. Walking to the bus stop after class, Margaret clutched the sheet music and CD in her canvas bag. The autumn air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalk. She had a week to decide what to do, but she already knew there was no good solution. She could refuse to play, but that would create even more attention and concern from her well-meaning classmates. She could play it poorly on purpose, but the thought of deliberately mangling Chopin made her feel physically ill. Or she could play it well and deal with the consequences of revealing who she really was. As the bus arrived, and she found her usual seat by the window, Margaret realized that Dr. Williams had unknowingly created a perfect trap. In trying to boost her confidence with a slightly challenging piece, he had chosen something that would force her to choose between her carefully constructed anonymity. The week crawled by like a slow-moving storm. Margaret went through her daily routine of cleaning houses, riding buses, and preparing simple meals in her tiny apartment, but her mind was elsewhere. The sheet music for Chopin's Minute Waltz sat on her small kitchen table, untouched but impossible to ignore. She had listened to the CD Dr. Williams gave her exactly once. The pianist was competent but uninspired, playing the notes correctly, but missing the soul of the piece. Margaret had turned it off halfway through and spent the rest of the evening staring at her hands, remembering what it felt like to bring real music to life. By Monday night, she still hadn't decided what to do. She could call in sick, but Dr. Williams seemed like the type who would check on students who missed class. She could show up and refuse to play, but that would create a scene she desperately wanted to avoid. Or she could go through with it and hope somehow to play badly enough to maintain her disguise. That last option felt impossible. Margaret had never played anything badly on purpose in her entire life. Even as a child, Her teachers had marveled at her inability to produce an ugly sound, her instinctive understanding of how to make every note sing. The idea of deliberately murdering Chopin made her stomach turn. Tuesday evening arrived anyway, indifferent to her anxiety. Margaret walked into the community center feeling like she was heading to her own execution. The familiar hallway seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lights harsher, the sound of her footsteps echoing with unusual loudness. She paused outside the classroom door, hearing the cheerful chatter of her classmates already inside. Through the small window, she could see the electronic keyboard waiting at the front of the room like an altar. For a wild moment she considered turning around and walking away, never coming back, finding a different life somewhere else. But she had already run away once before, from her homeland, from her career, from everything she had worked for. She couldn't keep running forever. Taking a deep breath, Margaret opened the door and stepped inside. "Margaret," Betty called out immediately, waving from her usual front row seat. "We've been looking forward to this all week." The other students turned to greet her with warm smiles and encouraging words. Janet had even brought flowers, small daisies from her garden that she had placed near the keyboard, for good luck. Their kindness made everything worse. Dr. Williams looked up from arranging his papers and beamed at her. "There she is, our featured performer tonight. How are you feeling? Ready for your big moment?" Margaret managed a weak smile and took a seat, not in her usual back corner, but in the second row where Dr. Williams had saved her a chair. "As ready as I can be," she said softly. "That's the spirit," Tom said, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. "Remember, we're all friends here. Just pretend we're not even watching." If only it were that simple, Margaret thought. Dr. Williams began the evening with his usual lecture, discussing different interpretations of classical pieces and how personal style influenced performance. Margaret barely heard a word. Her eyes kept drifting to the keyboard, and her fingers kept moving slightly in her lap, unconsciously running through the opening measures of the waltz. "Musical interpretation is deeply personal," Dr. Williams was saying. "The same piece can sound completely different depending on who's playing it. That's what makes live performance so exciting. You never know exactly what you're going to hear." Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, he turned toward Margaret with an expectant smile. "I think it's time for our special performance," he announced. "Margaret has been working on Chopin's Minute Waltz, and I know we're all eager to hear how she's progressed." The room buzzed with anticipation. Betty clapped her hands together excitedly. Janet straightened in her chair and pulled out her phone, probably planning to record the moment. Tom adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, not wanting to miss anything. Margaret stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Every step toward the keyboard felt monumental, as if she were walking across years instead of just a few feet of linoleum floor. She reached the small folding table that held the electronic instrument and paused. The keys looked different up close, cheaper than she remembered, more plastic than ivory, but still arranged in that familiar pattern that had been the foundation of her entire life. "Take your time," Dr. Williams said gently. "There's no rush." Margaret pulled out the folding chair and sat down. She adjusted the height slightly, a habit from decades of performing, then placed her hands in her lap and looked at the keys. This moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once she stepped forward, there would be no going back. "Whenever you're ready," Betty called out softly. Margaret lifted her hands and positioned them over the keyboard. Something shifted in her posture, so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But years of training had carved certain habits into her muscle memory. Her shoulders settled, her back straightened, her wrists found their optimal angle. She took one more breath and began to play. The first notes of the waltz filled the room, and immediately Margaret knew she was in trouble. Despite her best intentions to play simply, to hold back, her fingers moved with the precision and grace of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering this exact piece. The electronic sound was thin and artificial, but the phrasing was unmistakably professional. She tried to slow down, to make mistakes, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. They knew this music too well, had played it too many times to allow for deliberate errors. The rapid runs that made this piece famous flowed from her fingers, like water, each note crystal clear and perfectly placed. The room had gone completely silent. Even the usual sounds of people shifting in their chairs or clearing their throats had stopped. Margaret could feel the change in the atmosphere, the way attention had focused and intensified. As she moved into the more complex middle section, where most amateur pianists would struggle or stumble, Margaret's playing only became more confident. Her left hand provided a steady, sophisticated accompaniment, while her right hand danced through the intricate melodies with breathtaking ease. She was so lost in the music that she almost forgot where she was. For those few minutes, she wasn't Margaret the cleaning lady sitting in a community center. She was who she had always been underneath, a musician speaking the language she knew better than any other. The delicate passages that required the lightest touch emerged from the cheap keyboard with surprising beauty. The dramatic moments that demanded power and precision rang out clearly. Margaret's interpretation was nuanced and mature, full of small details that only someone with deep understanding of the piece could provide. She could see Dr. Williams from the corner of her eye, his mouth slightly open, his confident expression replaced by something approaching shock. But she couldn't stop now, couldn't suddenly play badly without making it obvious that she had been holding back. As the piece built toward its brilliant conclusion, Margaret's fingers flew across the keys. With stunning accuracy, the final ascending runs, which challenged even advanced students, flowed effortlessly from her hands. She reached the last chord and held it, letting the electronic sound fade into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The quiet stretched on and on, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Margaret kept her hands on the keys, afraid to turn around and see the expressions on her classmates' faces. Then the applause began. Not the polite, encouraging clapping she had expected, but genuine, amazed applause from people who had just witnessed something they hadn't known was possible. "Dear God," Dr. Williams whispered, his voice barely audible above the applause. Margaret, that was... She finally turned around to face the room. Betty was staring at her with her mouth open. Tom had taken off his glasses and was cleaning them, repeatedly as if he couldn't believe what he had seen. Janet had stopped recording and was simply gaping. Dr. Williams stepped closer to the keyboard. His entire demeanor changed. The condescending teacher was gone, replaced by someone who had just been completely humbled. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked quietly. Margaret sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, knowing that everything had just changed. Forever. There was no going back to being the quiet cleaning lady who knew a little about music. That woman had just vanished, replaced by whoever she really was underneath. The truth was about to come out, whether she was ready for it or not. The silence stretched like a held breath. Margaret remained seated at the keyboard, her hands still resting on the keys where the final chord had faded away. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on her, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around and face the questions she knew were coming. The applause had stopped, replaced by something heavier. Wonder, confusion, and a dozen unspoken questions hung in the air like dust particles in the fluorescent light. Dr. Williams was the first to find his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. "Margaret, that was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." She finally turned on the small bench to face the room. The expressions looking back at her were exactly what she had feared. Betty sat with her hands pressed to her chest, looking like she had just witnessed a miracle. Tom was shaking his head slowly, as if trying to clear his thoughts. Janet had put her phone down completely and was staring with the kind of intensity usually reserved for puzzles that needed solving. "I don't understand," Betty said softly. That was professional level playing. I mean, I've heard that piece on the radio, and you just played it better than most recordings." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words carefully. "Thank you. That is very kind." Dr. Williams stepped closer, his academic curiosity overtaking his shock. "Margaret, please. I need to understand. Where did you learn to play like that?" That wasn't someone who knows a little about piano. That was someone who has studied for years, decades even. The weight of the moment pressed down on Margaret's shoulders. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had hoped to control when and how. Now sitting in this fluorescent-lit community center classroom, surrounded by people who had been nothing but kind to her, she realized that the truth was inevitable. "I studied piano for many years," she said quietly, "in my home country. Before, I came to America. But you said you work cleaning houses," Janet said, not unkindly but with genuine confusion. "I mean, with talent like that." Margaret looked down at her hands, these hands that had spent the morning scrubbing kitchen floors and now had just played one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. The contrast wasn't lost on her. "Sometimes life takes us to places we did not plan to go," she said simply. Dr. Williams pulled a chair closer and sat down. His entire demeanor changed from teacher to student. "Margaret, would you be willing to tell us more? I think I speak for everyone when I say we'd like to understand." Margaret glanced around the room. These people had welcomed her without judgment, had tried to encourage what they thought was a nervous beginner. They deserved honesty even if it meant revealing how completely she had misled them. "I was born in a country where music education was very serious," she began slowly. "My parents noticed I had some ability when I was very young, maybe 4 years old. They worked extra jobs to pay for lessons even when money was tight." Tom leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of lessons?" "At first, just local teachers. But when I got older, I was accepted to the National Conservatory. It was a big honor, very competitive. Only a few students were chosen each year." Betty's eyes widened. "A conservatory? Like a real music school?" Margaret nodded. "I studied there for 8 years. Piano performance, music theory, composition. We practiced 6 hours every day, sometimes more. It was very demanding, but I loved every minute of it." Dr. Williams was listening with the intensity of someone having his entire worldview reshuffled. "And after the conservatory, I performed with orchestras, gave solo recitals. I had recording contracts, toured to different cities." Margaret's voice grew softer as she remembered. "For about 15 years, music was my entire life. I thought it always would be." The room was completely quiet now. Even the usual sounds from the hallway seemed muted, as if the building itself was listening to her story. "What happened?" Janet asked gently. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Political situations change. Economic situations change. Sometimes the country you grew up in becomes a place where you cannot stay, where your profession cannot survive." She didn't elaborate on the details, the way funding for the arts had vanished overnight, how musicians had suddenly become expendable, how her government had decided that classical music was a luxury their society could no longer afford. Some stories were too painful to tell in full. "My husband and I, we decided to come to America. We sold everything we owned to pay for the journey. We thought it would be temporary, maybe a few years until things improved back home." Tom cleared his throat gently. "And your husband?" "He died 2 years after we arrived. Heart attack. He had been working 3 jobs, trying to save money so I could afford to audition for orchestras here. But without proper connections, without the right networks." Margaret shrugged. "America has many wonderful musicians already. They do not need an unknown pianist from another country." The weight of her words settled over the room. These people understood struggle in their own ways, but the idea of losing an entire career, an entire identity, was difficult to grasp. Betty wiped at her eyes with a tissue. "So you started cleaning houses?" "It was work I could find quickly. No special English required, no references needed. I could start immediately and earn money for rent and food." Margaret's voice held no self-pity, just the practical acceptance of someone who had learned to adapt. "At first, I thought it would be temporary. But years pass quickly, and temporary becomes permanent." Dr. Williams shook his head slowly. "But surely you continued to play, to keep your skills sharp?" Margaret smiled sadly. I have a small electronic keyboard in my apartment. Not very good quality, but it makes sound. I play sometimes late at night when neighbors cannot hear. But it is not the same as real piano, not the same as playing for people who understand music. Is that why you came to this class? Janet asked. To be around music again? Partly, yes. And to practice my English, to meet people. I thought maybe I could just listen. Just be in a room where Chopin and Mozart were discussed like old friends. Margaret looked around at their faces. I did not plan for this to happen. Dr. Williams stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly racing. Margaret, this is incredible. Do you realize what you've been doing? You've been hiding your talent, working as a cleaner when you should be performing, teaching, sharing your gift with the world. The world did not ask for my gift, Margaret replied simply. And gifts do not pay rent. But Dr. Williams was already moving into planning mode. There are programs for immigrant artists, grants and scholarships. There are community orchestras that would jump at the chance to have someone of your caliber. You could teach private lessons, maybe even give recitals. Margaret held up a hand gently. Dr. Williams, you are very kind. But I'm 45 years old. In classical music, that is considered old for new beginnings. Nonsense, Betty said firmly, surprising everyone with her vehemence. 45 is nothing. You have decades of music left in you. Tom nodded enthusiastically. And think about all the people who could learn from you. I mean, we just did. In 5 minutes, you taught us more about music than we learned in weeks of theory. Janet was already pulling out her phone again. I have connections at the Cultural Center downtown. My company sponsors their events sometimes. I could make some calls. Margaret felt overwhelmed by their sudden enthusiasm, their immediate desire to fix her situation. These people, who an hour ago had thought she was a nervous beginner, were now ready to launch her back into a career she had abandoned years ago. I appreciate all of your kindness, she said carefully. But this life, cleaning houses, being quiet, it is not so bad. It is peaceful, in its way. Dr. Williams sat back down and looked at her seriously. Margaret, with respect, peace is one thing. But you're not just hiding your talent, you're depriving the world of something beautiful. That performance we just heard, that was a gift. And gifts are meant to be shared. Margaret looked around the room at these people who had become, without her really noticing, something like friends. They had accepted her as she pretended to be, and now they were accepting her as she really was. The difference was remarkable. Maybe, she said slowly, I could start small. Maybe I could play sometimes here in this class. Maybe I could help other students who want to learn piano. The room erupted in enthusiastic agreement. Plans began forming immediately. Dr. Williams could arrange for better instruments. Betty knew people who might want lessons. Janet could help with networking and publicity. As Margaret listened to their excited voices planning her future, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of early days in America, when she had still believed. Her old life might return, but a different kind of hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new from the pieces of what she had lost. The quiet cleaning lady from the back corner was gone forever. In her place sat a pianist, ready to make music again.